This video contains spoilers for both the original Final Fantasy VII along with the remake, as well as Crisis Core and Advent Children. There's a select few JRPG series that the average gamer has heard of. Think Pokemon, maybe Dragon Quest, or Kingdom Hearts. But most would be pressed if they hadn't at least heard of Final Fantasy. After all, these used to be the best-selling games of Sony's best-selling consoles for a couple generations. If they have heard about Final Fantasy, they most likely are aware of Final Fantasy VII. I've used this line in the past, but Cloud, Sephiroth, Aerith, Barret, and Tifa are all generally recognizable as characters. You could show their silhouettes and most would be able to name at least 3 of them. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most well-known and thus beloved JRPGs out there. That's why there is such a demand for the remake to exist. The original Final Fantasy VII released on January 31st, 1997, starring Cloud Strife as he joins Avalanche to save the planet. They initially worked to topple the Shinra Energy Corporation, who had been sucking the literal life force out from the planet. After they uncover a more sinister entity, they band together with new allies and lose friends, taking on the embodiment of God. Along the way, Cloud Strife has a mental collapse. The world he believed to be true was false. His reality was a conjuring of his Mako poisoning and memories of Zack Fair. That's the basic story summary, and it's why I loved the game. Final Fantasy VII has been so well regarded, it's still Square Enix's best-selling game of all time, minus the MMO. There's a reason it's been ported to so many platforms over the years. From the original release on the PlayStation 1 to the PC, mobile, PS4, and Switch ports, it's been played by tens of millions of players, not counting the innumerable amount who emulated or borrowed the game from a friend. It's Final Fantasy's most recognizable game, and it's become a brand unto itself. The success has created a movie, anime, figures, toys, plush, and spin-off games. These are the most recognizable characters in the series, and Square Enix knows that. I really liked the original Final Fantasy VII. It was my initial introduction to the Final Fantasy series. I first played it when the game was released on the Nintendo Switch eShop in 2019. I didn't beat it. I think I got stuck on the second disc somewhere or close to the end of the first one. I never went back to it. I used to have this issue with JRPGs, I just wouldn't finish them. Eventually, that all changed with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Then a few years after playing some other JRPGs, I was heavily getting into Square Enix games. I played their Tomb Raider titles, I adored Nier Automata and The World Ends With You, all of which were games I loved. So I went and picked up Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core on sale. Before playing it, I've made sure to finally play through the entirety of the original Final Fantasy VII, from the starting cutscene with Cloud jumping off the train, to the ending credits with the lions running across the empty world. I loved the game, I loved the characters, I really loved Aerith, Tifa, Barret, and Cloud. They were such interesting characters to me, and the way they interacted with each other, or how they changed each other, was special. I was already engaged in the game, but when Aerith died, I became even more interested. Although I knew it was going to happen, as it's perhaps the most spoiled event in gaming history, the effect of her loss was still present. I wanted to see how the plot would work out. There was something about the tranquility of her final moments with the group, the sincerity to her presence that was tough to get through, even as Sephiroth plunged his sword through her chest. Later on, when Tifa repaired Cloud's mind and coped with him through the livestream, I became even further engaged. I never knew this would happen, and it was mind-blowing. These were my 2 favorite moments of Final Fantasy VII, both not present in the remake, though there's hints of them early on. Part of what made me love the original so much were these less action-focused moments, the time where Cloud is bedridden, or when the party had to track down Yuffie. These weren't the most eventful hours of the game, but they were some of my favorites. Eventually, Final Fantasy VII becomes a more traditional JRPG where you defeat God, or in actuality a manifestation of what would appear to be a god. The journey there still meant a lot to me, as it did to many others. I don't think my experience with Final Fantasy VII is at all different to most. I think many of the game's largest fans felt similarly, or had the same experience in the world of Final Fantasy VII that I did. The fact that my journey across this world over 25 years after the original release would have been similar to the majority of the players who beat Final Fantasy VII is breathtaking. Millions of players experienced hope and loss the same way before I had, and surely millions will experience it in the same way for the first time after I did. This was why there was such a demand for it to be remade. Final Fantasy VII was most people's first Final Fantasy. It meant the most to them. They waited their entire lives to see it remade. They watched side stories, read spin-off novels, and played subsequent prequel games, all out of a desire to experience more of the extended universe of the game, to in some way return to Midgar. When the PlayStation 3 was revealed, Square Enix put together a tech demo highlighting what could be done with the technology. What did they choose to showcase the possibility of the hardware? Nothing less than a recreation of the Final Fantasy VII intro sequence. The opening panned throughout Midgar, revealing Aerith opening on Cloud. If the game was made for the PS3, it may not have looked nearly as good, as the hardware was notoriously hard to develop for. However, the earliest sign of seeing what the game could be like in HD and on comparatively modern hardware would fuel the fanbase for a decade. Just getting a couple minute long glimpse at the first spectacle of Final Fantasy VII in HD was enough for hype to skyrocket. hype that would never quell until a fully modernized remake was announced. At some point later on during a PlayStation E3 presentation, the lights in the room dimmed. The console had been out for a few years and lacked many real killer apps. Once the lights were on, what was revealed that day was that Square Enix would officially be remaking their masterpiece, their most acclaimed title on a modern platform in high definition, completely from the ground up. It could have new cutscenes, new characters, new combat, new anything. The possibilities of the remake were endless. Afterwards, the remake went through the stages of development hell, as many PS4 games did, and more importantly, as most Square Enix games had begun to go through. From Kingdom Hearts 3 to the cancelled Versus 13, which would later become Final Fantasy XV, a game that went through its own years of troubled development, the promises of HD gaming were near endless, but it was challenging for many Japanese studios to make the jump to modern architecture and the now Americanized industry standards. Square Enix had struggled to work on modern HD hardware. The 13 trilogy showed cracks, and moving to the PlayStation 4's even more powerful hardware was even more of an issue for the studio. In the time between the remake and the original, Square Enix had done everything in their power to milk out the brand of Final Fantasy VII. Sometimes the projects were good, Crisis Core, and other times they were mediocre, Advent Children. There wasn't zero Final Fantasy VII related content in between the original PlayStation 1 version and the remake's release, as there was a barrage for a long time, but those projects weren't what most wanted. They always wanted the original game to be remade. I don't just love the original Final Fantasy VII, I'd honestly tell you I'm into Crisis Core just as much. The story is certainly worse, but there's something about Zack that I love. I also think the gameplay of Crisis Core is more enjoyable, and the shorter runtime definitely played a part in my enjoyment. Final Fantasy VII is the better game, I like the story and characters more, but Zack has a special place in my mind when thinking about the inhabitants of this version of Gaia. I've also seen the Advent Children movie, but I didn't particularly like it. It's an okay work, but it hasn't held up voice acting wise. The action is also nauseating due to the speed, and the plot was bizarre until it made sense. I do have a soft spot for the movie, but it's not something I care for as much as the other works in the series. Part of the reason I adore Final Fantasy as a series so much is because of its characters, the biggest reason being Cloud. While Cloud was only the way he was because of the friendship he had with Zack Fair, I then really started to like Zack too. Afterwards, I played Crisis Core and got into the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. I may have been a fan of the original game before I played the prequel, but once I did, I became an even bigger fan. My perspectives on the compilation were however not the norm, which is understandable. The average fan wanted a remake, not a sequel movie, a spin-off with Vincent or a prequel with Zack, let alone the multiple defunct mobile projects. Fans wanted a remake, and when it was finally announced, it broke the internet. Fast forward half a decade, the world is in a pandemic, and numerous troubled Square Enix titles came and went. Final Fantasy VII was finally ready to come out, and it wasn't what was sold to them. It wasn't a remake of the original game. Final Fantasy VII Remake was some sort of a sequel remake, and that's unfortunate. I saw the drama surrounding the remake, and though reception was generally positive, I still heard much of the negativity, along with severe spoilers. I heard about what happened to Sephiroth and everything else. I didn't know how the game would get there, so it didn't really matter what I heard years ago. I also forgot about most of them. However, I didn't forget about the criticisms some of the hardcore and casual fans had. These were criticisms from a relatively small subset of the community, but they were still a rather large portion of the install base and represented a wide enough portion of the series' fans to negatively impact the sales numbers for Rebirth, and likely will affect the numbers of the third project in the remake trilogy too. That's my context going into the remake. I played the original game, and I heard about the remake's controversies, saw some spoilers, I watched the Advent Children film, and played through Crisis Core. I liked the original game's cast and many of the side characters introduced in the compilation's projects. Getting the chance to return to Midgar was an opportunity I wanted for a long time. So this year I finally took the dive with the restocks of the PlayStation 5 version, an opportunity I'm glad I took. I know Final Fantasy VII Remake is not nearly as beloved as the original, but I really loved the game. I loved the new content in the game, I loved the character expansions, I loved the gameplay, I even loved the story differences and alterations from the original. I could have enjoyed a straightforward remake as much as this reimagining, but who knows? Your first time playing a game is the most important. I already had the original journey. This remake was something entirely new. Final Fantasy VII Remake is much closer to complete remaking or reimagining of the world of Final Fantasy VII, and not a shot-for-shot remake. It essentially remakes what the original game meant, who the characters were, and the makeup of the story. There's lore reasons why this happened, and they're interesting to me, but they aren't for everyone, and that's understandable. Most people wanted a shot-for-shot, scene-for-scene remake of Final Fantasy VII, and not some sort of quasi-sequel reimagining of the original game. I loved the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I loved the newest additions, the characters. I loved what Square Enix did with Aerith. I loved the start of the game all the way to the ending. I even had goosebumps when the Crisis Core theme song played, as the only thing I could think about was whether Zack would cross paths with Cloud. It was an incredible moment. When Aerith gets the realization that something was off with the world, I couldn't believe it. There were so many other moments throughout the game that had me feeling that way, none of which would have existed if it was a straightforward remake. If Final Fantasy VII Remake was a one-to-one of the original game, the combat wouldn't have been so addictive, the music might not have been as refined, the characters wouldn't have been expanded, and who knows what else. I adored what the game did with the 3 forgotten members of Avalanche. Respectfully, Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie aren't often remembered. After the remake, I can safely say Wedge and Jessie will be. Jessie went from a small side character to Cloud's first real love interest. Her death meant so much more because of what we learnt about her family, and how she had likely fallen in love with Cloud despite Wedge's warning to him. This may not be the common opinion, but I'm glad Square Enix went this route for the remake. Without it, I don't think I'd have had such an incredible experience. For me, it was worth doing the Final Fantasy VII Remake this way, but I'll gladly admit it wasn't for everyone. But for me, it was perfect. There was something special about the game. To me, this is the perfect reimagining of the Midgar section up until the final 3 hours. And if the game was a simple remake of Final Fantasy VII, it might not have been. There's so much I loved about this portion of the remake trilogy. How about the music? I love Final Fantasy music, and the original Final Fantasy VII has an incredible soundtrack. But Remake does so much to make the music better than the already incredible soundtrack. The OST is so beautiful, and because it's all been redone, it elevates the game so highly. Characters in the remake are improved further than ever before. Aside from the side cast and new additions, Cloud has loads of character development. His visions of Sephiroth are consistent early on, which is different from the original. It makes the game deeper and sets up my favorite scene early in the game. The same can be said for Aerith. She knows what happened in the future. She knew that Sephiroth would take her life and what may happen to the world if the group were to fail their mission. Her character became even deeper. She tells Cloud not to fall in love with her. The irony, of course, is that she would fall in love with him regardless of her knowledge of the future. Her character was always a tragedy, but it's so well defined from the start of Final Fantasy VII Remake to the end. Take Tifa or Barrett on the other hand. Their character development wasn't really a part of the remake, and yet the representation here of the two of them is very high quality. Tifa is caring, thoughtful, subversive, and powerful, while Barrett was kind and compassionate under the fierce mask he put on. These were all important to the characters by the end of the original game, but in the remake they have the defining character traits earlier on. It makes the characters feel realer. There's so much of that. There's a realness to Remake. Of course, the imagined events all take place, but between all of them are small moments that defined my experience with the game and elevated it above what I expected. I would not have enjoyed a Final Fantasy VII Remake without the quaint and calm moments of downtime. This one had those moments from the original and more. The story was a huge highlight of Final Fantasy VII, and Remake is the first third of the game's story with a plot twist ending. But the remake also excels with gameplay. The crawling, crouching, and squeezing through vents and shafts aren't fun, but the combat is. I may not have liked the constant invisible loading screens, but what those screens hid were great. The battles were so fun, the combat in the game is incredible, and it's so addictive. This game has probably the best battle system Square Enix has ever designed, and a direct remake may not have included it. I loved everything about Final Fantasy VII Remake. There were things I didn't adore, but they were so infrequent they didn't matter to me. This was a special game to me, and I don't know if there was a way to make it any better. However, the ending section before the final scenes was something else. I liked the ending, but the giant purple monster, it didn't make any sense. The game was so rushed towards the end credits that even if I enjoyed what was before the credits, the final chapter still made no sense to me. There are these spirits that prevent changing the canon of the universe. Now they're a giant monster. It wasn't explained very well, and that's a shame. It's all very cool, but poorly thought out, or specifically poorly explained. After you defeat the Whispers, Cloud is on his own. It would be his time to confront Destiny and defeat Sephiroth, who despite being here exclusively for fan service, was still a worthwhile inclusion. The final chapter may have been rushed, but what it led up to was worth it. That's the message I had of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Some parts were abnormally slow, others were too quick, but the final scene was worth it. The new world born from the acts of Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, Barrett, and everyone else in Avalanche was worth doing, no matter what they may lead to. Thanks for watching. This was a weird video for me because I wanted to make it as in-depth as possible, and when I started writing it at first I had no trouble making it that way. Then I took some time off, and when I went to finish it I had trouble wrapping it up. I really love Final Fantasy VII Remake, as you can probably tell from this video. It's definitely up there with my favorite Final Fantasy games. Really, it's up there with my favorite games of all time. There was just something special with the game that I've struggled to put into words. I don't know how people view the game nowadays, but I know for a fact that I view it positively. I'd love to hear any other views on the game. I haven't kept up with the online conversation of it since it came out, so I don't know if there was a positive or negative reevaluation post-Rebirth. Either way, I hope you're able to enjoy the video. If you did, any likes, comments, or support on it helps. I've got a Final Fantasy VII Intermission video going up next, so if you want to see that, or if you liked this video, you could subscribe to my channel, or click on any of the videos on screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.